Okay, now it's time to make a solder splice. So what we've done here is taken our battery snap connector, and because the wires on the end are a little bit flimsy, we're gonna put some solid core wires attached to the end. So I've taken about 3/4 of an inch of insulation off of the battery connector for both the black and red wire. And I've also taken a short piece of solid core wire and taken about 3/4 of an inch of insulation off of both of those as well, and then twisted them into a Western Union splice. The other end of the wire here, we don't want to take off all that much, about 1/4 to 1/2 inches lots. Any more than that, we start to expose too much conductor because those are going to get put into our breadboard and we don't want to create a short circuit there. So once you have that set, we are going to put these into what's called our helping hand. So I'm going to put one here and one right there. So we're looking at our black wire first. When you get your soldering station, you want to make sure you turn it on. So there's a switch on the side here. We're going to flick that switch on, and now you should see a red light here. So that red light indicates that it's heating just like an oven. Once it gets up to temperature, which we're going to set to 400 degrees Celsius, which is about 750 degrees Fahrenheit. When it's up to temperature, it is going to stop staying on and it's going to start flashing just to maintain that temperature. Okay. In the meantime, we're going to take our sponge and we're going to make sure that it's wet. So I'm just going to dip it in some water here, soak it up, and just so we don't make a mess, I'm going to kind of hold it as we come over to the table there. All right, now we have a nice wet soldering sponge. We can see that our light is flashing on and off, so we're now ready to start soldering. Now, anytime you're going to solder, you want to make sure you have a nice clean tip on your soldering iron. So you can clean it by taking nice light brush strokes across your nice wet sponge. And that'll make your soldering tip nice and clean and shiny. If you find that that soldering tip won't get clean, it's possible that it has oxidized. So if that is the case, then it might be time to replace the tip. If it still transfers heat, it'll work fine. But if it's having troubles transferring heat, you might have to turn your temperature up or exchange the tip for a different one. Now, when I'm ready to solder, what I'm going to need is a piece of solder. So I'll show you guys how to take some off the roll. If there already is some solder sitting over here off the roll, use it up first. If there isn't, then just take some off the roll, roll it between your fingers like this. And then you can take your piece, and what I like to do is just kind of wrap it around like that. And now you have a little bit of a handle with some solder sticking out that you can use, and then unroll it as you need more. Okay? When you're ready to start soldering, you want to apply a little bit of solder to the tip. It's called tinning your tip. Now what that's going to do is allow a better heat transfer to the object that you're soldering, and it'll let it heat up quicker. So I'm going to tin the tip. Once the tip is tinned, I'm going to bring my soldering iron underneath where I'm trying to solder. So I'm not going to bring it over top of my solder joint. Instead, I'm going to bring it up from underneath, and then I'm going to apply my solder to the top. Now, what we don't want to do is goop a bunch of solder on our iron and paint it on. Instead, we have to make sure that that metal that we're joining together is hot enough to melt the solder. So the way you do that is by heating it up and then tapping your solder on the metal you're joining together. If you put it on the iron, it should melt because the iron's going to be hot enough. But we want to wait until the two wires that we're joined together are high enough temperature to melt the solder. Otherwise, we won't get a nice clean solder joint. Okay? So I'm going to tin my tip a little bit on there. Okay? And then I'm going to take my soldering iron and put it underneath my solder joint. And then I'm going to tap the solder on top, and it's starting to melt already. I got a nice fresh tip on here. And I'm just going to slowly work my way across and add a little bit of solder to fill in that space, just like that. Okay, so I've now completed my solder joint. What I want to do when I'm all done soldering is apply a little bit of solder to the tip. We just kind of coat it with solder. So we always tin the tip before we shut it off, put the soldering iron back in the station, and then we turn our switch off. Never leave the soldering station on. It's going to cause those tips to oxidize quicker and they won't last as long. Putting that coating of solder on the tip helps it last longer as well by giving it that coating. Once you're all done, you can take it out of your helping hands. Remember, it's going to be pretty hot, so don't hold it near the solder joint. And now you can see what your finished solder joint should look like. We'll let it just get into focus there. So you can see that we have a nice smooth consistency and our solder is holding our wires together, and a little tug on that doesn't cause it any strain. There's one last step to do for this, and I'll show you in the next video.